In the years leading up to 1940, the German military swept across Europe with an efficiency the world had rarely seen. They bypassed traditional static defenses, utilizing highly mechanized spearheads to paralyze their opponents in a matter of weeks. Sovereign borders were physically dismantled. Nations that had stood for centuries found their defensive lines shattered and their territories occupied almost before they realized they were at war. Adolf Hitler had repeatedly overruled his senior officers to force this offensives. When his gambles paid off, he began to view his strategic intuition as a messianic gift. But tactical brilliance on the ground is severely compromised when tethered to a dictator who refuses to be questioned. Over the following 5 years, this absolute refusal to heed objective advice drove a series of strategic misjudgments. The man commanding the Third Reich inadvertently served as the Allies' most effective asset. Basic military doctrine dictates a nation should avoid dividing its forces across multiple fronts. Yet in June 1941, while still locked in a struggle with Great Britain in the West, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union to the east. By December of that year, the offensive had stalled. Exhausted German divisions suddenly faced a brutal Soviet winter counteroffensive on the outskirts of Moscow. Just 4 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler made a completely gratuitous choice. Despite having no strict treaty obligation to join Japan's offensive, he stepped before the Reichstag and formally declared war on the United States. This chart shows the United States could produce as many munitions in 1 year as Germany could in 5. Hitler dismissed this potential. Here, the combined economic weight of the US, Soviet Union, and Great Britain completely dwarfs Germany's resources. By voluntarily choosing to fight a simultaneous war against the top economic superpowers, the regime guaranteed its own destruction by pure mathematics. The strategic missteps quickly filtered down from global geopolitics to localized battlefield management. In 1942, during a major offensive aimed at securing vital oil fields in the Caucasus, Hitler suddenly split his forces to capture a city named after his rival. The Battle of Stalingrad devolved into a grueling fight through frozen rubble. Hitler stubbornly poured divisions into the city long after it lost any military utility. This personal obsession blinded him to the massive buildup of Soviet reserves on his flanks. When the trap finally closed, an entire German field army was encircled and starved, resulting in over 750,000 casualties. 2 years later, as the Red Army launched Operation Bagration, another operational flaw emerged: the absolute refusal to yield ground. German generals desperately requested permission to execute tactical retreats and establish deeper defensive lines. They were denied. Bound by strict stand and die orders from Berlin, 20 German divisions were locked in their forward positions and subsequently obliterated by advancing Soviet forces. When a leader hundreds of miles away micromanages frontline tactics to protect his own ego, temporary setbacks on the battlefield inevitably compound into permanent, army-destroying disasters. This disconnect from reality also ravaged Germany's resource allocation, beginning well before the war started. Instead of investing heavily in a massive U-boat fleet, the one weapon capable of strangling Great Britain's supply lines in 1940, vast resources were squandered on building a traditional surface navy that ultimately saw very little use. Fast forward to June 1944, and we see this paranoia strike again. When Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, Hitler was convinced it was merely a massive deception operation, believing the true target was further north at Pas-de-Calais. Acting on this flawed intuition, he kept 6 powerful panzer divisions sitting completely idle on D-Day, forces his commanders desperately needed to push the invasion back into the sea. Even in the final months, the delusions continued. In late 1944, Germany managed to scrape together a few newly refitted armored divisions. Rather than deploy these mobile reserves to the east to slow the massive Soviet advance, they were thrown into a doomed offensive through the Ardennes forest in the west, the Battle of the Bulge. A dictator who substitutes objective data with his own paranoid fantasies will always burn through his most precious resources, fighting shadows rather than facing the real threat. Right up to the final months of 1945, the German army remained a remarkably lethal fighting force, often inflicting significantly more casualties than they sustained. But tactical prowess on the ground means nothing when the entire system is collapsing from the top down. Authoritarian systems create a dangerous echo chamber. By executing or exiling critics and surrounding himself solely with yes-men, the Supreme Commander prioritized his own personal prestige over logistics, intelligence, and hard data. A commitment to the myth of invincibility ensures that isolated battlefield errors compound into a total systemic collapse. The Wehrmacht's fighting capabilities were harnessed to a vile cause, and humanity remains deeply fortunate that the greatest military threat the free world ever faced was directed by an ego so unchecked it functioned as the Allies' most lethal weapon.